How do fish reproduce? It's a common question. What about Nemo here? Little clownfish like this. Does his parents really look after him after he hatches out of the egg? Let's look at some of the misconceptions and what's the reality in fish reproduction. Fish can produce millions of offspring in a season, but before we can understand why, let's get into some biology. There are three modes of reproduction we can talk about. Most mammals are viviparous, meaning that they give live birth. Most fish are oviparous, meaning that the eggs and sperm are released into the water and undergo what we call external fertilization. That means the eggs develop outside the mother's body. There's also something called ovoviviparous, in which the eggs develop and hatch within the mother's uterus. This is most common in sharks. Now let's talk about population ecology. We use the letter R to stand for growth rate. When a population has a positive R value, then you'll see a growth curve that looks a bit like this. On this graph, you'll see time on the x-axis and the number of individuals in a population on the y. Notice that there's a really quick increase in the population size right away. We call this exponential growth, and it's typically due to the fact that there's plenty of resources, food, shelter, maybe even lack of predators. At some point, the party's going to come to an end, and the population will level out, generally because there's not enough resources to sustain that high level of growth rate forever. That's because there's some form of environmental resistance, typically meaning that there's not enough food or resources to support that size of a population. The red line labeled carrying capacity represents the maximum population size that can be supported by a particular ecosystem. We use the capital K to represent it in most equations in writing. Populations generally will fluctuate around the carrying capacity, with little booms and busts or cycles based on predator-prey relationships or seasonal cycles of food availability. So what does all this have to do with fish reproduction? Well, remember how I mentioned fish can have millions of offspring in a season? The majority of fish are what we call R strategists, meaning that they base their reproductive strategy on high growth rate, or R. They want to have as many offspring as possible, but put very little energy or effort into them. That means that most of their offspring produced are not going to survive. They're going to become food for other species. On the other extreme are K strategists. These are organisms that are long-lived and work towards carrying capacity, or K. This means they have very few young and put a lot of effort into raising them, thus a much lower mortality rate for the offspring. Marine mammals and even humans are examples of K strategists. Now, R and K strategists represent two ends of the spectrum. You can have, for example, some fish species that are very long-lived and seem like K strategists, but they still produce thousands of offspring with high mortality rates, and that seems a little bit more like R strategists. Now let's talk survivorship curves. This graph depicts three types of curves found in living organisms. You might guess that humans exhibit a type 1 curve. There's very little mortality until you get to the end of our natural lives. This, of course, represents a lot of K strategists. On the other end of the spectrum is type 3 curves. These are organisms that have very high mortality rates early on, but the few who survive will live on to old age. Most fish fall under type 3 curves, which is why it's more important for adult fish to have as many offspring as possible without expending energy on parental care. That means when the fish are hatched from the egg, they are on their own, and the vast majority of them die very young. Fish have a few ways they can reach this high reproductive rate. We'll look at two of the big ones. First, broadcast spawning occurs when eggs and sperm are released into the water column. Parrotfish and wrasses exhibit this behavior. It usually begins when the male performs some sort of vertical dashes that we generally call signal jumps. When the female approaches, the male swims in tight circles. The female will then rise from below, and both fish will shoot up into the water column, releasing their gametes. What you're watching is the very quick act of broadcast spawning by a male parrotfish and a female. Now we'll look at some older footage of a blue-headed wrasse. The super male is the one with the big blue head, and you can watch him doing his little darting behaviors, zigzagging around trying to attract the female. When the female comes, it happens very fast. Here it is again. Watch for that quick movement up in the water column vertically and back down again. Literally thousands of eggs and sperm are released into the water at that moment. Another strategy is benthic egg laying. This often occurs with damselfish, and that includes the clownfish like Nemo. Here in the Atlantic Ocean, we don't have clownfish, but we do have the sargent major, which are easily recognizable by their yellow coloration and black bars. When the male sargent major gets ready to reproduce, he adopts a darker coloration and works hard to prepare a bare patch of rock for a nest. The challenge, of course, is to attract a female to lay her eggs on his nest. The females will basically shop around from male to male to see who has the best nesting pad. When she chooses a male's nest to lay her eggs, the male will go right behind her and fertilize them. Once she's finished, the female abandons her eggs, leaving the male sargent major to defend the nest from predators. That's right, it's the male sergeant major who provides protection for his young. But don't go giving him the Father of the Year award yet. A few days later, when the eggs hatch, this fishy dad leaves his offspring to fend for themselves. That's why this still really falls under the category of an R strategist, even though the male provides just a little bit of parental care. So let's go back to Nemo. As we've seen, most fish are oviparous and are strategists, meaning they generally bank on having thousands of offspring at a time, with very few surviving to adulthood. That means that even though male clownfish protect their nests, once the eggs are hatched, little Nemo is on his own to face all the dangers in the ocean. This might seem a little harsh, but remember, ecosystems are all about energy. There are many organisms in the ocean that depend on planktonic fish larvae and even juvenile fish for food. So in a way, the vast number of offspring produced by fish helps support the ecosystem. Now remember that I've been discussing fish reproduction in general with a few specific examples. Nature, of course, always has exceptions and variations on the rule, so there are many more stories to tell when it comes to fish reproduction. There are even a few species that put a little bit more effort into caring for their young. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about how fish reproduce in the wild. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to click that like button and of course subscribe for more.